This teenage boy has been on the FBI's radar since he was just 14 years old. He's stolen houses, cars, yachts, and even airplanes, despite having no pilot's license or formal flight training. In total, this kid committed 67 crimes, including assaulting police officers and stealing their weapons. The guy was living a real-life version of GTA Grand Theft Auto, but in the real world. And he wasn't just playing around, he was outsmarting the FBI for years. They chased him from city to city and island to island, but they just couldn't catch him. This story sounds too crazy to be true, but the wild part is, it is true. You're about to witness for yourself the unbelievable events that made this case so legendary. Buckle up, because it's going to be a wild ride. Our story today is about a boy named Colton, who lived what might be the wildest teenage life in history. Honestly, I don't think any other teenager has experienced the level of chaos that Colton did. It all started with his rough upbringing. Colton grew up in a toxic household. His mom was an alcoholic and his dad was a drug addict. Eventually, his parents divorced and his father abandoned them without offering any support. Life for Colton and his mom was incredibly tough. Their home was an old, run-down trailer, falling apart on the outside and barely livable on the inside. Colton and his mom lived on Camano Island, a part of Washington State, not Washington, D.C., but the state in the Pacific Northwest. Camano Island is one of many islands in the region and had a fairly large town, almost like a small city. But Colton and his mom lived in one of the poorer areas of the island. As if poverty wasn't bad enough, Colton's mom barely cared for him. Her only focus was where she could get her next drink. She was constantly intoxicated, leaving Colton to fend for himself, even for basic necessities like food. With no other options, Colton turned to theft. He started small, stealing food and drinks from local stores and supermarkets. But being inexperienced, he often got caught. Sometimes he'd spend a day or two in juvenile detention centers, not quite prisons, but secure facilities with guards and surveillance. Unsurprisingly, Colton also faced problems at school. He was constantly in trouble, getting suspended repeatedly. His mom? She couldn't care less. No matter how many times the police or school officials tried to reach her, she ignored them completely. By the time Colton was 14, he was stuck in this cycle of trouble. Over time, though, he began to evolve. His petty thefts escalated to breaking into homes. He learned how to pick locks, break them, or even find where homeowners hid spare keys. Whenever he broke into a house, the first thing he did was head straight to the fridge. He'd grab food and drinks, then make himself at home. He'd sit on the couch, watch TV, or even play PlayStation. It was as if he was claiming a little slice of normalcy in the middle of his chaotic life. Colton always tried to target empty homes, especially ones whose owners were away on vacation. What made his life easier was that many houses on Camano Island were vacation homes, only occupied during the holidays. This gave him plenty of opportunities to sneak in, make himself comfortable, and enjoy the luxuries of someone else's home. He would sometimes stay in these houses for days, treating them as his own. He'd take a shower, change into fresh clothes, and relax like he belonged there. Occasionally, he'd even find a car in the garage. Colton would take it for a joyride around the island, and when he was done, he'd fill it up with gas, clean it, and return it in pristine condition. Before leaving a house, though, Colton would take everything valuable he could carry. If he found a safe, he'd break into it and pocket the cash and jewelry. Electronics like laptops and PlayStations were fair game, too. He'd even raid the freezer, taking frozen food with him. Now, you might wonder why he bothered refueling and cleaning the cars, but had no qualms about stealing everything else. In his mind, the things he took, cash, jewelry, electronics, were covered by insurance. He thought he wasn't really harming anyone because the owners could file a claim and get reimbursed. Of course, anyone who's dealt with insurance companies knows how difficult and frustrating that process can be, but Colton seemed to convince himself that he was still a good person with some kind of moral code. By this point, Colton had completely stopped going back to his mom's house. He lived on his own, either staying in the homes he broke into or camping in a tent deep in the woods. His tent never stayed in one place for long. He moved it frequently as he roamed from one area to the next, stealing from houses, stores, and anything else he could find. At the end of the day, he'd return to his tent with his loot, cash, credit cards, food, and whatever else he needed. One of the more bizarre targets he went after during this time was a fire station. His goal? To steal a thermal imaging camera that used infrared technology. Firefighters use these cameras during rescues to detect people behind walls or in hard-to-see areas. Colton, however, wanted it for a different reason: to scan houses before breaking into them and ensure no one was inside. The thermal imaging camera became a crucial tool for Colton, allowing him to scout houses more safely and efficiently. But that wasn't all. He also managed to purchase night vision goggles, the kind used by military personnel. Imagine this: he spent thousands of dollars on them, paid for using stolen credit cards. With these gadgets, Colton's operations became even more sophisticated. For several months, Colton lived alone in his tent deep in the woods, moving from place to place on the island and breaking into houses. Reports of burglaries flooded the local police department. The authorities had been working on the case for some time, and their investigations eventually led them to identify Colton as the main suspect. They pieced it together through his past record. He had been arrested before, and they had his fingerprints, photo, and other details on file. When he disappeared from school and his mother's house, it all clicked. The police were certain Colton was behind the string of burglaries, but catching him was a different story. They distributed his photo and declared him wanted. Soon his face was familiar to everyone on the island. However, Camano Island wasn't a small, isolated place. It had several towns and areas, some of which were as large as small cities, making it easier for Colton to stay hidden. Meanwhile, Colton's audacity was growing. He continued using stolen credit cards to order gear online, everything from survival tools to bear spray to help him live in the wilderness. But here's the twist: he would have these items shipped to the homes of the credit card owners, then sneak onto their porches to steal the packages. His boldness was unmatched, but it was also what eventually led to his capture. In 2007, when Colton was 15, he broke into a house and decided to stay the night. Feeling completely at ease, he turned on the lights and made himself comfortable. But the neighbors knew the homeowners were away on vacation, and seeing the lights on, they called the police. Suspecting it might be Colton, the police responded with a significant number of officers. They surrounded the house, blocking every possible exit to ensure he couldn't escape. When the police stormed the house, they found Colton sound asleep on the bed, completely unaware of the commotion outside. They woke him up and said, "All right, buddy, it's time for jail." This time, they didn't take him to a juvenile detention center designed like a home or school. No, this time, Colton was sent to a real jail. At just 15 years old, Colton was sentenced to 4 years in a juvenile detention facility for 21 felonies. Despite his past, Colton stood out in jail, not as a troublemaker but as someone quiet and focused. Unlike many other inmates, he avoided conflicts and spent his time productively. He immersed himself in books, practiced drawing, and developed a growing fascination with aviation. He even sketched airplanes in meticulous detail, a hobby that would soon become central to his story. Colton seemed like a model inmate. He followed all the rules, attended discussions and educational sessions, and spoke about his future plans. He told supervisors he wanted to return to school, go to college, and build a better life. His transformation appeared genuine, but behind this facade, Colton was playing a long game. He knew that maintaining good behavior would eventually lead to a transfer to a less secure facility, a juvenile detention center that resembled a home or school with minimal security compared to the high-security jail he was in. After 10 months of impeccable behavior, his plan worked. Colton was moved to a lower security facility, but as soon as he arrived, he began studying the guards' routines and analyzing the security measures. It didn't take him long to find a weakness. One night, with nothing more than his belongings in hand, Colton quietly slipped out of a window and escaped. The facility didn't even have a perimeter fence, making his escape almost effortless. Once again, Colton was free. By 2008, now 17 years old, Colton returned to the life he knew best. He set up camp in the woods, living in a tent, and resuming his pattern of breaking into houses, shops, and even on one occasion, a small bank. His physical fitness played a huge role in his ability to evade capture. He was strong, agile, and fearless, enabling him to climb, break in, and escape with ease. In one notable incident, Colton targeted a store selling tools and equipment. The window he used to enter was on the second floor, but that didn't deter him. He climbed up, broke in, and raided the storage room for supplies. Inside the same room, he found a safe. Determined to get to its contents, he grabbed a metal rod and relentlessly hammered at the safe until he managed to crack it open. Colton's return to his old ways set the stage for an even wilder chapter in his already unbelievable story. The police were actively searching for Colton, but he remained elusive. One night, after breaking into yet another house, he stumbled upon a powerful luxury sports car, a Mercedes unlike anything he had ever seen. Unable to resist, he stole the keys, started the engine, and took it for a wild ride. Pushing the car to its limits, he sped through the streets at an insane 200 kilometers per hour. At one point, he flew past a police car, immediately drawing their attention. The officers began chasing him, but Colton noticed them right away. For a few thrilling minutes, he led the police on a high-speed pursuit, weaving through the roads. Then, in a desperate attempt to escape, he veered off the road into a dense forest, crashing the car into a tree. Without hesitation, he abandoned the wreck and bolted into the woods. Reinforcements arrived, and the police scoured the area trying to corner him. They brought dogs, equipment, and even helicopters to assist in the search, but Colton slipped through their grasp once again. Meanwhile, his string of thefts continued, each time striking a new location, but the situation escalated further. During one of his escapades, Colton stole an assault rifle from a police vehicle. This was a dangerous turning point. Although his previous crimes had been non-violent, the theft of a firearm was a serious escalation. Now Colton was armed, and the authorities were on high alert. The island's police launched an intensive armed manhunt, with officers patrolling heavily armed, accompanied by dogs and aerial support. The FBI joined the investigation, issuing a $10,000 reward for information leading to his capture. Even bounty hunters got involved, hoping to cash in on the reward. While the authorities were tightening their search, Colton seemed to be living in a completely different world. He was planning something no one could have imagined. His love for airplanes, which had developed during his time in juvenile detention, had grown into an obsession. After his escape, he ordered aviation manuals and guides to study how planes worked. He also purchased a high-performance laptop using stolen credit cards and started playing Microsoft Flight Simulator, a highly realistic flight simulation game. Through the simulator, Colton taught himself the basics of flying. His goal? To steal an actual airplane and take to the skies. It was hard to tell if this boy was reckless or a misunderstood genius. After months of studying flight manuals and practicing on the simulator, Colton began observing a small local airport on the island. It was a modest facility used by private pilots with small aircraft. Little did anyone know, Colton was preparing for his most audacious act yet. These planes were small, carrying only a handful of passengers, not the large commercial airliners you might imagine. Yet the sheer audacity of Colton's actions left anyone who learned about them stunned. How could someone be so bold, so fearless, and yet so reckless? Now, you might wonder, how did the authorities not catch this on radar? Well, here's the thing, planes flying at an altitude of 18,000 feet or below are typically off the radar. This range is standard for helicopters and small private aircraft, making it normal for such flights to go unnoticed by air traffic control. Colton, exhilarated by his airborne adventure, made one critical oversight. He hadn't checked the fuel tank. The gauge was dangerously close to empty, and reality hit him hard. He was flying on borrowed time, and the plane would soon run out of fuel. The most challenging and dangerous phase of flying is landing, and now he had to figure out how to pull it off. With no other option, Colton prepared for what's called a crash landing. He aimed the plane toward an open area and brought it down, smashing it into the ground. Miraculously, he walked away almost unscathed, save for a few scratches. Barely taking a moment to process what had just happened, Colton got to his feet, abandoned the wreckage, and disappeared into the nearby forest. When authorities were alerted about the stolen plane, they didn't even consider Colton as a suspect. The immediate assumption was that drug traffickers were behind the theft. After all, who else would dare steal an airplane? At that time, Colton was the primary suspect in almost every reported theft of homes, cars, or stores on the island. But a stolen plane? Even the police couldn't fathom that he'd pulled off such a feat. The flight itself was short, just a few kilometers, so he hadn't gotten far. The police continued their relentless search, coming close to catching him on several occasions. Once they even discovered his campsite. They raided it, but Colton had sensed their approach and slipped away moments before they arrived. From a safe distance, he watched as they confiscated his belongings, including his aviation manuals. This was the moment when the police began to suspect that Colton might actually be connected to the plane theft. The manuals he had been studying matched the model of the stolen aircraft. Still, they dismissed it as a coincidence. Even they couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that this young fugitive could pull off something so extraordinary. If you think his first attempt at flying would be enough to satisfy him, you're underestimating the way Colton's mind worked. This was just the beginning. Once again, Colton made his way to the airport and stole another plane. This time, his destination was a neighboring island, part of Washington state. The theft was smooth, no one suspecting a thing. Once he arrived on the new island, he wasted no time and headed straight for a supermarket. Surveillance cameras captured his every move as he walked through the store, carrying a crowbar. Inside, he found a forklift, the kind used in warehouses. Without hesitation, he used it to pry open an ATM, pulling it right off the wall and taking all the cash inside. But this wasn't his only crime on the island. Colton hit multiple stores, and his fingerprints were found everywhere. The police now knew he was on this island. His name was becoming known far and wide, and people were baffled by how a teenage boy could pull off such incredible feats. Colton's reputation began to grow even beyond the island. People started calling him the Barefoot Bandit because in most of the surveillance footage, he was seen walking around barefoot. The reason was unclear, but he felt his movements were smoother without shoes. This nickname stuck, and soon fan pages were popping up on Facebook with followers in the tens of thousands. Videos about him flooded YouTube, some even creating songs or graffiti of him on walls. It had all grown so big that people were even printing t-shirts with his face on them. Colton seemed to be enjoying the fame, and in one of his supermarket heists, he took his time before leaving. He grabbed a piece of chalk and drew barefoot footprints on the floor, as if acknowledging the nickname given to him by his fans. It was his way of embracing the title. Eventually, Colton decided it was time to leave this island. The police, along with the FBI, were closing in, and even local airports were under surveillance. The heat was on, so he stole a boat and sailed back from Canada to the U.S. Once back, he resumed his car thefts. He had learned to avoid using the same car for too long, knowing that gas stations had surveillance cameras that could track him. Instead, he would drive the car until the fuel ran out, then abandon it and steal another. His spree continued with no sign of slowing down. Colton's wild journey continued until he arrived at an airport in a small town in the state of Idaho, which is right next to Washington. Once again, for the fourth time, he stole another plane. This time he flew it to an area called Granite Falls, located in Washington. It's unclear whether he specifically targeted this location or was just flying aimlessly, but when he arrived, he spotted what looked like an open field and decided to land there. What Colton didn't realize was that the field wasn't empty at all. It was covered in tree stumps. From above, it appeared like a clear space, but by the time he noticed the stumps, it was too late. He was already descending, and the plane was fully committed to landing. With no other options, he braced himself and landed the plane among the stumps. The landing was rough, and the plane hit the stumps violently, breaking apart on impact. But miraculously, Colton survived yet again without any serious injuries. This man wasn't just daring and reckless, he seemed incredibly lucky too. As soon as he got out of the wrecked plane, Colton did what he always did. He ran straight into the nearby forest. However, this time, the area wasn't deserted. There were people who witnessed the crash, including a logger working nearby. The logger approached the scene and found the plane smashed into the ground, with no one inside. These are actual photos of the plane wreckage and the field where it crashed. The authorities were quickly notified, and the police arrived, along with the FBI and even special forces. Helicopters circled overhead as the area was sealed off and checkpoints were set up. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. A person repeatedly stealing planes and flying them posed a significant security threat. During the massive search operation, the police received a tip from a local family who spotted a strange man hiding in the nearby woods. The police immediately rushed to the area and began combing through the trees. Sure enough, they found Colton hiding among the foliage. Caught off guard by the officers and their search dogs, he bolted and abandoned all his belongings in his escape. When the authorities searched his belongings, they found a bag stuffed with cash, nearly $20,000, as well as a camera filled with selfies he had taken. Despite the extensive manhunt by the police, FBI, and special forces, Colton managed to evade capture once again. Unbelievably, with all the attention and resources focused on catching him, Colton pulled off yet another plane theft, the fifth one. This time, he flew to Orcas Island, continuing his daring, almost unbelievable escapades. Colton's escapades took a new turn when he landed on yet another island in Washington state. This time, the landing was much smoother than his previous attempts. Though not perfect, the plane wasn't destroyed, which was a significant improvement. Once he arrived on the island, he did what he always did, committed a few robberies. But then, surprisingly, he disappeared. For several months, Colton seemed to vanish off the radar, cutting off all his movements entirely. Most people assumed he was dead, drowned in the sea, or perhaps met some other fate. After all, it wasn't like him to stay quiet for so long. But Colton wasn't one to disappoint his unintended audience. On San Juan Island, another island in Washington, the locals were startled by a strange sight, a large footprint drawn on the dock. Alongside it, a boat had gone missing. This was Colton's dramatic way of announcing his return. It was as if he were playing the role of a star in a TV show, performing for his fans. From there, he stole another boat and made his way to Lopez Island. Once again, he didn't linger. He stole yet another boat and returned to his original stomping grounds, Camano Island. The problem: the residents of Camano Island despised him. Many of them wanted him gone so badly they were willing to take matters into their own hands. Meetings were held where locals discussed how to stop him. They organized armed night patrols and search groups. Even the owners of small planes would camp by their aircraft at night to guard them. But Colton, with his usual cocky flair, couldn't care less. He didn't plan on staying long anyway. As soon as he arrived, he stole a car and left the island. He drove across the bridge connecting Camano Island to the mainland, heading into Washington's towns. During his travels, Colton left behind his signature touches. In one instance, he stopped by an animal shelter, leaving a note along with $100. The note read, "I passed by, had some extra cash. Please use this to take care of the animals," signed boldly as the Barefoot Bandit. Colton wasn't even trying to hide his tracks anymore. It was like he was challenging the authorities, saying, "Come and catch me if you can." Colton's ambitions grew bigger. He decided to leave Washington and explore the rest of America. He moved from state to state, stealing cars as he went. True to his style, he'd drive each stolen car until it ran out of fuel, never stopping to refill. This clever tactic made him harder to track. Along the way, he broke into multiple airports in different states, looking for the perfect plane to steal. Despite the authorities' best efforts, they couldn't pin him down. Colton crossed thousands of miles, spanning 9 states and stealing 11 cars, before finally reaching an airport where his next big plan awaited. The plane Colton had his eye on was parked in a city in Indiana. He hid among the trees near the airport, keeping a watchful eye from a distance. Being so far from Washington, no one in Indiana was expecting their plane to get stolen. Colton knew this, so he waited patiently for the right moment. When it came, he made his move. He climbed into the plane, started it up, and with no hesitation taxied down the runway and took off, just like that. This flight would be Colton's last. It was also his longest journey yet, taking him south to the Bahamas, a completely different country and an independent island nation. When Colton reached Bahamian airspace, locals noticed something unusual, a plane circling the same area 4 or 5 times before it began descending. There was no airport beneath him, just open land. Despite that, Colton executed another improvised landing. This time, the ground was soft and muddy, which helped cushion the plane. The landing went surprisingly well, and the plane suffered only minor damage. Once again, Colton emerged unscathed. He left the plane and disappeared into the nearby woods. Bahamian authorities soon discovered the abandoned aircraft and identified it as American. They quickly contacted U.S. authorities, who confirmed their suspicion. Colton Harris-Moore had arrived in the Bahamas. The news spread like wildfire, making headlines on television and in newspapers. Everyone knew now the Barefoot Bandit was on the run in the Caribbean. Colton wasted no time settling into his new surroundings. He broke into a shop and a restaurant, stealing some cash, food, and supplies. With everything he needed, he retreated back into the woods. But he wasn't just hiding. Colton was enjoying himself. He went swimming in the ocean, explored the beautiful island scenery, and acted as though he were on vacation. Eventually, Colton stole a car and drove to one of the main towns on the island. There, he began scoping out the marina. He noticed a boat owner docking his vessel and watched from a distance as the man parked his car nearby and left for a nearby restaurant. Colton seized the opportunity. Breaking into the car, he found the boat's keys, grabbed them, and dashed to the marina. He started the boat and sped off before anyone could stop him. This time, Colton headed to another Bahamian island, Eleuthera. He found a secluded spot to hide among the trees and stayed there for about a week, avoiding detection. By now, his face and name were everywhere, on the news, in newspapers, and even on wanted posters plastered around the island. Sometimes, he would pass by cafes or restaurants and see his own face staring back at him on the TV. Knowing the authorities were closing in, Colton kept a low profile. He even began disguising himself, wearing hats, and covering his face to avoid recognition. Feeling exhausted by his situation, Colton decided to steal another boat. He slipped out of the marina with it, cruising aimlessly through the open sea for a while. Then, in a moment of what can only be described as audacious or possibly unhinged behavior, Colton did something baffling. He steered the boat right back toward the marina and began showing off, speeding around in circles as if putting on a performance. 2 young men standing on the dock couldn't help but notice him. They exchanged confused glances, wondering what this reckless young white guy was up to. As Colton maneuvered closer to them, he grinned and called out, "Don't you know who I am? I'm the Barefoot Bandit." One of the men immediately recognized him but played dumb, replying, "We don't know you." This man, however, had a plan. He knew there was a $10,000 bounty on Colton's head and wanted to get close enough to catch him. Colton, ever sharp, saw right through the act. "Don't play dumb," he said with a smirk. "Go ahead, call the cops. I want them to come. I'll have fun messing with them." His cocky tone left no doubt he was enjoying himself. While the first man tried to engage Colton in conversation, the second one discreetly pulled out his phone and called a friend, someone who owned a boat. Their plan was simple: get their friend to bring his boat and chase Colton down. But Colton noticed the phone call. "Oh, you're calling, huh? Well, good luck." With a wave and a sarcastic grin, he sped off into the water. The two men stood on the dock, watching him disappear into the distance. Minutes later, their friend arrived with his boat, bringing along 5 other men. Now a group of 6, they set off in pursuit of Colton. It wasn't long before they spotted him, sitting calmly on his boat, not even trying to escape. In fact, Colton was smiling, as if daring them to catch him. When they closed the gap between their boats, Colton suddenly revved his engine and took off. A high-speed chase ensued, with Colton zigzagging across the water, cutting sharp turns and weaving unpredictably. He seemed to be relishing the challenge, like it was a thrilling game. At one point, one of the men in the pursuing boat pulled out a handgun and aimed it at Colton. But Colton, ever the skilled navigator, made a sharp maneuver that sent a wave of water crashing over his pursuers. The driver of their boat was temporarily blinded as water splashed into his eyes, causing him to lose control. The boat veered off course, leaving them floundering as Colton sped away into the distance. Later, the boat's owner would admit, "That guy could drive a boat like nobody I've ever seen. It was clear he knew exactly what he was doing." Colton, now far ahead, didn't waste time celebrating his victory. He made his way to a nearby marina ready for his next move. The marina backed up to a grand estate, complete with a watchful security guard who had been observing the strange events unfold. From his post, he saw a lone young man in a boat being chased by a larger group in another vessel. The group was shouting as if they were in the middle of a war, furiously pursuing the boy's boat. The guard hesitated, debating whether to call the police, but his attention was drawn to the lone boat speeding directly toward the marina. Colton's boat barreled forward at full speed. The guard waved frantically, signaling him to slow down, but Colton ignored him, slamming the boat into the dock with a loud crash. Before the boat even settled, Colton leaped onto the dock and sprinted toward the estate. Surveillance footage captured the chase. Colton ran as if his life depended on it, his breaths heavy and frantic. He made it to the estate's grounds where the guard confronted him near the house he was hired to protect. "What's going on?" the guard asked, alarmed. Colton, gasping for air, replied, "They're trying to kill me. They're trying to kill me." The guard looked baffled. "Who's trying to kill you?" he asked, but Colton didn't answer. Instead, he darted past the guard, disappearing into the dense shrubs and trees surrounding the estate. The guard gave chase, but Colton was quick, weaving through the greenery. Eventually, Colton found a hidden spot among the trees and crouched down to hide. Realizing he couldn't catch him on his own, the guard immediately called the local police chief, a personal acquaintance. "It's him," the guard said urgently. "The kid from the news, the Barefoot Bandit, I'm sure of it. He's hiding in the trees near the house. Get here fast and bring back up." The chief wasted no time. He sounded the alarm, calling every available officer, on duty and off duty, to converge on the area. Even those sleeping were told to report in. Within minutes, the estate and marina were swarming with police officers. They created a perimeter, blocking every possible escape route. Colton, however, was no ordinary fugitive. Using the trees as cover, he skillfully evaded detection, sneaking his way back toward the marina from the opposite side. Moving quietly, he slipped into the water and began swimming toward a nearby boat. The officers and bystanders were scanning the grounds, unaware of his movements below. Slowly and silently, Colton climbed onto the boat, keeping its lights off to avoid attention. A few people noticed the faint movement of the boat drifting away from the dock and murmured in confusion. But before anyone could react, Colton fired up the engine and the boat roared to life. Realizing what had happened, the crowd shouted in alarm. The police scrambled, but their patrol boats weren't immediately available. Seeing the urgency, a few residents at the marina offered their boats to the officers. Two police teams jumped aboard the borrowed vessels and set off in pursuit. But Colton had already gained a significant lead. With the engine roaring and the wind in his face, he sped off into the open water, leaving his pursuers struggling to catch up. During those tense moments, Colton kept glancing back to see how close the police were. In his distraction, he failed to notice a sandbar jutting out from the island ahead. His boat slammed into it, grinding to a halt as the motor whirred helplessly. The propellers kicked up sand, but the boat wouldn't budge. Frustrated, Colton kept revving the engine, hoping to free himself, but it was no use. Meanwhile, the police boats were closing in, their weapons trained on him. Finally, they were within shouting distance, yelling at him to surrender. At the same time, with his other hand, he was still trying to steer the boat, adjusting the throttle and attempting to break free from the sandbar. Then, in one final burst of determination, he twisted his body, cranked the throttle to maximum, and somehow managed to get the boat unstuck. The vessel lurched forward, but just as it started moving, the police opened fire, not at Colton, but at the boat's engine. Their aim was to disable the motor and prevent him from escaping. Bullets tore through the air, striking the engine repeatedly. Realizing his boat was immobilized, Colton abandoned the wheel, ducked down, and screamed, "I surrender! I surrender!" He raised his hands, shielding his head as the officers closed in. Once they confirmed the boat was no longer operable, they ordered him to stand and put his hands up. This time, Colton complied without resistance. Finally, after 2.5 years on the run, Colton Harris-Moore was captured. The police brought him back to the marina, where a crowd had gathered, snapping photos and filming the moment. Colton tried to hide his face, unwilling to be captured on camera, but it was too late. The Barefoot Bandit's reign had come to an end. The Bahamian police had achieved what U.S. authorities and even special forces had failed to do. Remarkably, Colton was still barefoot when he was taken into custody. Whether it was his request or a nod to his infamous nickname, no one could say for sure. In a surprising twist, the Bahamian authorities didn't press charges for his crimes on the islands. Instead, they fined him $300 for entering the country illegally. Their goal was simple: hand him over to U.S. authorities as quickly as possible, knowing that far more severe consequences awaited him back home. When Colton was extradited to the U.S., the next time he appeared in public, he was wearing a pair of white sneakers. His trial began in 2010 and dragged on for several months, bringing an end to his legendary run as the Barefoot Bandit. At 19 years old, Colton was no longer considered a juvenile. He would be tried as an adult, facing the full weight of the law. The charges against him were staggering: 67 counts spanning 3 countries, the United States, Canada, and the Bahamas. If convicted on all counts, he faced up to 30 years in prison. But Colton managed to secure one of the best lawyers imaginable, John Henry Brown. Known for taking on the most challenging cases, Brown had a reputation for defending even the most notorious criminals, not to exonerate them, but to mitigate their sentences. One of Brown's most infamous cases was defending Ted Bundy Ostanda, one of history's most well-known serial killers. For Colton, Brown's strategy was not to contest the charges, but to convince him to plead guilty to all of them. At the same time, he focused on painting a picture of Colton's troubled childhood and the hardships he endured. Brown highlighted the neglect, the hunger, and the environment that shaped Colton into the person he became, asking the court to consider his circumstances and the pain he carried. The judge and jury took notice. Despite the severity of his crimes, they empathized with his story. In the end, Colton was sentenced to just 7 years in prison, a far lighter punishment than anyone expected. Even more surprising, Colton didn't serve the full 7 years. He was released after 5 years on parole in 2016 at the age of 25. After his release, Colton faced the challenge of rebuilding his life with a criminal record. Remarkably, John Henry Brown offered him a job as an assistant in his law office, giving Colton a rare second chance. Colton later spoke in interviews about how much he despised the person he used to be. He expressed a strong desire to leave his past behind and focus on the opportunities ahead. He began exploring ways to share his story, giving talks about his wild teenage years and what he learned from them. Looking back, Colton's adolescence may well have been the most chaotic and reckless of anyone on this planet. At such a young age, he stole homes, cars, boats, planes, robbed banks, and even escaped from prison. It's hard to imagine a crazier teenage experience than that. If you know someone with a wilder story, let me know, because Colton's life truly feels like it belongs in a movie, and with that, we've reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Check out these other awesome videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Next one, take care. Next one, take care. Next one, take care. Next one, take care.